Hello again, fellow audiophiles. I am Wave Theory, and this is the ZMF Homage. This is a $1,200 US solid-state headphone amplifier. This was a kind loan to me from Zach and his team at ZMF Headphones. ZMF has made no attempt to influence my opinion on this piece one way or the other, so all thoughts that you are about to hear are mine and mine alone. This piece is also a collab with JDS Labs, so Zach and his team co-developed this amplifier with John Sieber at JDS Labs. So there is a lot of influence on JDS Labs tech in this piece as well. So how did that turn out? All right, find out right after shameless self-promotion.
Hello. I'm one of the reasons that Wave Theory can't spend all of his money on audio gear. He wants you to know that your support is vital for keeping the channel running. So if you enjoy Wave Theory's bussin' review riz and no-cap review style and want to encourage him to stay in the basement so I don't have to listen to his dad jokes as much, like the video and subscribe to the channel. You can also send him a donation on PayPal or sign up for the Patreon. Links are in the description. Now on to the review.
The Homage is again a $1,200 US amplifier and again a collab between ZMF and JDS Labs. It is so named the Homage according to ZMF's website because it is meant to be a homage to your favorite headphones, right? They were attempting to build an amp that was transparent and let your headphones be what they are, and so they thought Homage would be a good name there. And you can also see that they kind of carry through that, like it's also a bit of a homage to like vintage audio styling with the color scheme and the shape and like the VU meter on it and all of that too. So it kind of has this retro, I think, cool aesthetic look to go along with it as well. So that is what the Homage is in terms of just like the big picture, 1,000-foot view of what it is and why it's here and where it comes from. Now a little bit more specific. It is claimed on the ZMF website to be a Class AB. However, it is a mostly op-amp-based circuit design from what I can glean from their website. I didn't open it up to look all that, but like their websites talk about the op amps that they use, but they don't name anything like transistor type or capacitor type or anything like that. Also, the unit is rather light. There's not a ton of heft to it, and that is also usually a bit of a hallmark that it's more of an op-amp-based design in terms of its internal circuitry. There's nothing inherently wrong with that. I'm just letting you know up front that that's what it is. All right, so I think we could go ahead and dive into like the specs, and then we'll look at the unit tour and so forth. So this is a balanced input but single-ended design according to the ZMF website here. So internally, I understand that to mean internally that it has balanced to single-ended conversion, and there are balanced outputs on the back of it as well as single-ended inputs. And just quick note, these inputs are not switchable. I believe that it defaults to the balanced XLR input, so you don't want to connect both of these at the same time. It's just one input. You get two different flavors in terms of which kind you want to use based on whatever DAC that you have. Now on ZMF's website it says it's perfectly fine to use the single-ended input, but this unit sounds its best from the balanced in. And I don't know if that's because they're super proud of their internal balanced to single-ended conversion, or if that's just more of an artifact that around this price range, if a DAC has balanced outputs, it very likely sounds better from its balanced outputs than it does from its single-ended output. So I'm not sure which way it goes on that, okay, but that's what they say. But I mean, this is the back panel other than the power input and the master power switch here. So I mean, for what it's worth, there it is. That's the back of the unit. Okay. But even if it is internally single-ended, what we have on the front here is two balanced outputs in terms of balanced headphone outputs. You get 4-pin XLR and then you get 4.4 millimeter Pentacon. The rated output power on this thing into a 32 ohm load is 2.2 watts per channel. That drops to 475 milliwatts per channel at 150 ohm impedance load, and then 119 milliwatts per channel at a 600 ohm load. All right, other interesting features on this thing. let's go ahead and do a unit tour on that here, and like bring in those interesting features as we go. Because again, you see very simple and elegant front panel here. If you want a little bit darker finish to the color here, you can get this in a darker color as well when you order from the website. Okay, but let's talk about all of these switches. This switch right here is just a simple mute. Okay, do you want the output live or not? This switch right here is interesting because this is an output impedance selector switch. So the rated output impedance on this when the switch is in the low position is 0.7 ohms, which is very low, and that's about where we want output impedance to be on a solid state amplifier anymore. However, you do have the option of flipping that switch up and increasing the output impedance to 47 ohms. Now, what does that do? That decreases the damping factor between the amplifier and the headphone. And so I have a whole video that is a couple of years old now and it explains like what output impedance and damping factor is and how they affect sound. So I will put a link to that down in the description below. But just to kind of summarize that really quickly, damping factor is the ratio of the load impedance to the output impedance of your amplifier. And the bigger that number gets, in other words, the bigger the damping factor gets, then the more damping the amplifier can exert over driver motion. So the higher the damping factor is, that basically tells you that the better able your amplifier is to stop the driver, either the cone or the dome of a speaker or like a planar magnetic membrane in a headphone or something like that. But whatever your driver is, the higher the damping factor, the more easy it is, or the better the amplifier is at stopping that driver from moving once it is already moving. So the higher damping factor you get, usually the drier the sound becomes because the amplifier has more ability to snap that driver back to the resting position or get it to change direction once it is already moving. That can have audible effects, particularly in the bass, where bass can often sound a little bit like more present because where bass can sound a little bit more present because there's often a little bit more driver overhang. It doesn't snap back as quickly anymore. But generally, a lower damping factor is just going to create a wetter sound. Like it's going to be a more blended together sound where the trailing ends of tones and the leading edges of subsequent tones are blended together a little bit more, and there's not as clear a separation between them. Okay, so that's an interesting option to have on an amplifier like this. And that means, at least tells me, that this is geared more towards higher impedance loads and all that, and in terms of what it's able to drive. So think like 80 ohms and up, I want to say. Like both my ears and the way this is made kind of tell me that that's where this thing really gets comfortable. And I'll unpack all that as we go on, because one of the things that high impedance loads can do is allow you to use a lower damping factor, okay, with more realistic and easier to make like output impedance kinds of values. All right, and then that allows you to kind of tailor and customize the sound a bit more, okay, with a high impedance load in that way. All right. More on what that does and how that sounds on this unit and with some headphones when we get to the sound section. Then right here we have the gain switch. There are 3 gain stages on this amplifier here. And ZMF's website claims that this thing is equally comfortable driving IEMs as it is driving high impedance dynamic loads or like current hungry planar magnetic headphones and all of that. I don't know that I fully agree with that statement. More on why I say that in the sound section coming up. Okay, but other than that, like we have aluminum here, and then these are wood panels on the ends and all of that. It's a nice looking unit. The feel of the volume knob is pretty good too, and it's also interesting with this volume knob, which is attached to an Alps 27mm pot, that you can control it here as well, just by using your finger there on that knurled part on the top of the unit right there. So that's an interesting touch there. And then the VU meter, when it's lit up and that needle is bouncing back and forth as a signal goes through it, that just looks really cool. Also, on the subject of cool, let's talk literally temperature. Like this amp never gets particularly warm, and I think again that comes back to it mostly uses op amps to do the amplification. So it uses energy pretty efficiently. So it's not like a class A amp that is on at full blast all the time and you just use the potentiometer to not blow your head up, okay? Because those things can kick out a lot of heat. This one stays relatively cool. All right, the only other two other things I want to talk about the build here really quick. One, there are no rubber feet that come installed on the bottom. Shipping with this is some adhesive sticky feet, okay, that you can put on here to keep it from sliding around, but it is a lighter unit, and so without those feet, it does slide around on a desktop quite a bit. I did not put any of those adhesive feet on because, as far as I know, I do not get to keep this unit, and I don't know if the next person will want those feet on there or not. So I just dealt with that, and we'll let whoever gets this amplifier next make the decision as to whether or not they want those feet on there. So that's kind of like complaint one about the build. It's relatively minor, and again, those feet, those sticky feet, come with the unit. They are in the box when you open it up in a little baggie, so you can apply as many of those as you want in any way that you want to mitigate that issue. The other thing I want to talk about is this just visually drives me a little bit nuts, and that is that the 4.4 millimeter Pentacon output here is not centered in the opening in the chassis for it, okay? And that shows up in a couple of other places on this as well. It's less noticeable, but is still noticeable on these RCA inputs, and also on these front switches. Some of the switches and outputs and all of that are just not super well aligned with the holes in the chassis that allow them to pass through the front panel and all of that. And that's not a big deal. It's just a little bit weird to me coming from a company like ZMF that has kind of staked its brand on having excellent build quality and aesthetics and attention to detail on the build and the appearance of things and all of that. So again, it's not a problem from a functional standpoint or anything like that. It's a very minor thing. It's just slightly, I will call it annoying to me for that to happen on a $1,200 unit, and again, from a company that makes build and aesthetics a big part of its brand. And it's not just this unit that has that issue. If you look at the photos of the Homage on ZMF's website, either it was this one that they took pictures of, or they're just all that way. And I think it's probably more all of them, because the one with the darker plate on the front here had the same issue. You could tell in the photos that this output right here is not centered on the opening. Okay, all right. And that's all I will say about that. It's time to move on. All right. Let's start turning our attention towards the performance and the sound quality here. And so to do that, we'll talk about test gear. All right, all digital audio files from me in terms of the music sources that I use. So we're talking lossless or high-res FLAC files or local DSD files, all played either locally or streamed via Qobuz through Roon. And then from Roon endpoints that I would have used would have been my a Sonor Ultra Rendu streamer, which would in turn go through a Singer SU6 DDC, or through my Chord Hugo 2 directly, or Chord 2 Go streamer directly through a Chord Hugo 2 DAC, used as a DAC in this case because this is not a headphone itself. All right, other DACs that would have been connected to the Singer and the Sonor Ultra Rendu streamer would have been the Musician Pegasus 2, which I'm working on a review for and hopefully won't be too much longer on that. And then also my Berkeley Alpha Series 2 as my reference high-end DAC, and a little bit the Ferrum Vandla with Hypsos power supply in there, working on a review on that as well. Okay. Headphones that this thing would have driven, that's some English good. All right, that this would have driven. Let's start with low impedance dynamic driver headphones. That would include the Focal Radiance and the Fostex TH900 Mark II with Lawton Purple Heart chambers on it. Low impedance, easy to drive planar magnetic headphones would have been the HiFiMan HE1000 SE, the HiFiMan HE1000 Stealth Magnet Edition, and this one right here, that is the Meze Empyrean 2. And also, when I had it in for review, the Meze Lyric 2 got a significant amount of run on this amplifier as well. All right, medium-ish, let's just go medium and high impedance, medium and high impedance dynamic driver headphones. Those include the ZMF Bokeh and the ZMF Atrium Closed. Bokeh I am working on a review for, that should be out in the near future as well. And I also have a recent review for the Atrium Closed out, so see the link down in the description for that. Also used an original Focal Utopia, which is a nominal 80 ohm load that spikes to about 300 ohms near its driver's resonant frequency, which is somewhere in the 60 to 80 hertz range. I don't remember exactly where, but it's in that range. All right, so again, medium to high impedance there. And then I also used the Mastrop plus Sennheiser HD6XX, which is a 300 ohm load and well known, and also the Beyerdynamic DT880 600 ohm, again, well known there as a high impedance headphone. That one I have personally detachable cable modded so that I can plug it into the balanced output of some headphone amps like this one. All right, then some other and harder to drive planar magnetic headphones. I tried briefly the HiFiMan Susvara, and then also the Modhouse Tungsten got some run on here as well. Recently reviewed that one, see link down in the description as well. Okay, what did I learn through all of that? Let's come back to what I said at the top of the video, where the Homage is so named because it is made as a homage to your favorite headphones. And from reading ZMF's website, they really wanted this to be an amp that lets your headphones be themselves, right? And I partially agree with that statement. I found that this was a really very strong headphone amplifier for high impedance loads. And so that means most of ZMF's line. It is very well optimized for high impedance dynamic drivers, I find. And so we'll unpack that in a little bit. So if your favorite headphones are high impedance dynamic drivers, or like ZMF's, a lot of ZMF's line, then yes, this is a homage to those. It is not as strong for low impedance dynamics or for planar magnetic headphones in general, I found. And I didn't try it with IEMs just because that combination was just of no personal interest to me. It's not that I find IEMs in general non-interesting, it's just that I don't find them interesting in desktop situations where this clearly is meant to be used. Okay. So that's just kind of the takeaway on that one. So let's talk about the sound and the presentation. The perceived frequency response on this is pretty neutral. I really did not notice any area of the frequency spectrum that felt pushed forward to me or recessed to me relative to the rest of the 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz audible spectrum. Okay, so pretty flat in terms of its frequency response, and here flat meaning neutral. In terms of presentation, this one very much reminded me of, or made me think of it being as like a grown-up version of the JDS Labs Atom and Element series kind of sound. Which again is not surprising because it's a collab with JDS Labs. So those amps, if you have heard them, they are very clean, very clear. They have that black void sonic background to them. So just very, very low noise floor, basically absent noise floor. Okay, but they also kind of have like just a very technically focused, I don't want to say it's all the way into, but kind of leaning analytical kind of presentation. And to my ears, they can suffer in terms of like they don't sound as natural or organic in their timbre. They're not quite as realistic as some of their competitors can be. And I think a lot of those traits made it into this amp as well. So this one has that more like clean, clear, clarity-focused, black void sonic background, leaning slightly analytical in its presentation, but it does bring in more of that natural and organic kind of timbre even at least more so than the cheaper Atom and Element series amps. It does a better job of bringing in more of that kind of realistic and natural kind of sonic flavor and character here at this price point. Okay, so that's like generally what the presentation is to me. Now I'm going to mostly focus on how it performs when it is driving a high impedance dynamic driver headphone, because really that is where it is most comfortable. And with that kind of headphone, the sound stage is nice and wide, okay? Side to side, and even in the height dimension, the sound stage is pretty big. There is a little bit of depth to it as well, but not a lot. It is not a wall of sound presentation, so it's not completely flat, but I have heard better at this price point in terms of the depth and the layering of the soundstage. Imaging and separation are also pretty good. There's a pretty good sense of, hey, sounds are right here and there's not sound to either side of it, but it also doesn't sound like discrete, where there's like clear zones of sound where things can be, and then there's nothing between. It does kind of blend it together well enough. So there's like a nice and generally fairly natural balance between the imaging and the separation, and then the separation being appropriately, well, separated without it sounding artificial or emphasized in that way. Okay, the impact and the dynamics are okay. I think it does benefit from being paired with a more dynamic and hard-hitting kind of headphone. So like the Atrium Closed, for example, had a lot of physical impact. Now the Atrium Closed is a hard-hitting headphone to begin with, and so I think that complements this pretty well. If your headphone is already lacking a bit in dynamics, this really isn't going to help it out a whole lot in there, but it's also not poor in terms of the impact in there either. All right. Those are the, we'll also talk about resolution here. The resolution, particularly with the high Z headphones, is also strong. I wouldn't call it best in class, but it is strong. It does a good job of resolving room reverbs and ghost notes and things like that. There's nothing that really jumps out to me as being noticeably missing or lacking about its resolution, but I also was not completely enamored with its resolving prowess either, because I have heard other amps near the price point to pull out a little bit more subtle details from the sound as well. But again, it's good, not poor in that regard. Okay, I do want to get to a couple of things that I found not so great about the sound, even with some of the higher impedance stuff. And that is like when the sound starts to go wrong, it's usually in the upper mids, lower treble, where it can sound a little bit harsh and forward. Not really shouty or honky, but there's definitely a glare to the sound that can come out in the upper mids, lower treble before it happens with some of its competitors in that space as well. So it's not on every headphone, and it's not all the time, but I did notice that because of that slightly analytical leaning kind of presentation, there is less margin for error there in that upper mids, lower treble before it just gets a little bit too forward, and then it just starts to glare at me, and then I find that fatiguing. Now, with high impedance headphones, you can stave off that glare a little bit by using this output impedance setting. Okay, so let's use what I just said there to transition to what this output impedance switch can do here. So again, it changes the output impedance from 0.7 ohms to 47 ohms. And that did two things sonically most of the time. And again, you notice this, or at least I noticed this the most with high impedance headphones. And that is, one, the headphone gets quieter. That should not be surprising, because like when you have a high output impedance, like let's just in an AC circuit, an alternating current electrical circuit, which an audio circuit is, what things that are loads on the circuit do, what impedances do, is they transfer some of the electromagnetic energy that's coming from, in this case, the amplifier, to a different form, right? That could be thermal energy, it could be other kinds of energy, but that's usually what it is in an amplifier, is it takes some of that electromagnetic energy and converts it to thermal energy, and that leaves less energy left behind to actually make it to your headphone driver. And on this unit, that translates to when you engage the higher output impedance setting, your headphone will get a few decibels quieter. It's not a huge thing, but it is noticeable, so you got to turn up the volume pot just a little bit. So if your headphone is, first of all, really high in impedance to begin with and also really hard to drive, then sacrificing that few dB might mean that you're not going to get all the way up to the volume level that you want. Like, that's particularly an issue on something like the Modhouse Tungsten to keep in mind. Okay. Now, the other thing that the output impedance does here is it does create that slightly wetter sound. So, again, like, as best I can describe this, and you just kind of have to hear it to understand it, is it moves it from being a slightly drier sound to a slightly wetter sound. And that translates to there is not as clear a distinction between when the decay on one tone ends and the attack on the next tone begins. Okay, they're a little bit more blended together. Now, that has differential impact for different headphones. The Utopia, the Bokeh, the 6XX and the DT880, as well as the Atrium Closed, I thought all benefited a little bit from that higher impedance output. Made them a little bit smoother sounding and just kind of gave them a more rounded out, fuller kind of sound. The other positive thing that I noticed with that impedance switch, and like was the thing that transitioned us to talking about it here, is that especially with like the Utopia and the Bokeh, I noticed this the most, is like when that upper mid lower treble glare that this amp can have sometimes starts to get in the way on those kinds of headphones, flip that switch and it staves off when that glare starts. Okay, it kind of makes that upper mid lower treble range a little bit sweeter and a little bit more natural sounding. You turn the volume up again and it can come back, but you have to get much louder than it was before you change the impedance setting for that to come back. So that was pretty cool. I thought, like, that's one way to mitigate some of that mid-range glare that was coming out on this thing here. Okay. Let me make a few comments then on what happens when you do use a low impedance can on this headphone or on this amp and what that sounds like. Because most of the stuff that I talk about, most of the positives here were about high impedance cans. Something like the HE1000 SE sounds good but not great on here. I think you can definitely get better for the price in terms of an amp for that headphone. A thing that I was surprised was the Focal Radiance, which is generally not amp picky at all. Did not like this amp, right? It got like that on that one. I just could not get rid of that harshness and that glare in the upper mids, lower treble. It was just always there. It was not a good match. Okay, likewise, the TH900 was also not a good match. Now, that's not necessarily the Homage's fault because the TH900 is not a good match for about 98% of the headphone amplifiers on the planet, I'm afraid. Okay, so I don't hold that against this one, but I'm always on the hunt for an amp that handles the TH900 well, because when that headphone is driven well, it's amazing. Okay. Other stuff, so I mean, those are just kind of rough thoughts there. The Meze Lyric 2 I thought sounded really good on this one, and that one is interesting because it is nominally a 60 ohm load, which is starting to get like middle high. But what's interesting, if you watch Andrew from the Headphone Show's review of the Lyric 2, he graphed the impedance of the Lyric 2 from 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz. And I don't remember exactly where it was, but it was somewhere in the region of like 1 to 1.5 kilohertz. There was this really big impedance spike where normally the Lyric 2 was something like 25 to 35 ohms of impedance, somewhere in that range, and then spiked to like over 100 ohms, I want to say, around 1 or 1.5 kilohertz right there. And that was one way Meze was trying to get their mid-range presentation to smooth out a little bit on that headphone by putting some electrical filtering in there. And this amp likes the higher impedances, so that translated well to this amplifier. So that was an interesting case on there as well, that overall I liked the way the Lyric 2 sounded on this one. Okay, some quick notes about DAC pairings on this one as well. Because of the like really clean and kind of clarity focused and like leaning slightly analytical presentation of this, I liked this amp better when it was paired with something that was a little bit smoother and maybe even a little bit warmer, but smoothness is definitely the name of the game here in terms of pairing with this one. So like the Pegasus 2, the Musician Pegasus 2 was a really good pairing to this, not only in terms of price, because that one's also about $1,100 I think, but also just it's a warmer and smoother and more laid back kind of sound to it, and that really complemented the more forward and slightly analytical presentation of this amp as well. Things like my Hugo 2 and my Berkeley, which are more neutral and very incisive and a little bit detail forward in their presentation, can still sound good on this, but on some headphones in particular, it can just be a little bit too much. And I think you can also like control that glare in the upper mids, lower treble a little bit by just backing off the aggressiveness of the presentation of the DAC a little bit. So just some quick thoughts on that there. All right, let's talk briefly about comparisons between this amp and other similarly priced amps. Now, this is the fourth amp that I have reviewed, 3 of them very recently, in this kind of like $1,100 to $1,300 kind of price tier. The others would be the Erzatich Perfitus, which I reviewed like well over a year ago, and we'll put a link down in the description. But more recently, I've reviewed the Vio HPA V222 and the Schiit Molnir 3. The latter two there are both $1,300 US. And I'm going to hold up the V222 here in particular. I'm working on a comparison video of all 4 of those amps that I just mentioned here that will hopefully, if it's not the next video after this one releases, it will likely be like the one after the next one. Okay, so coming up very soon. I think the V222 of that group is the most direct competitor to the Homage because they both really specialize in high impedance loads. So between these two, what you have then are some options. Do you want a warmer, fuller, and like lots of sub-bass impact kind of sound and a little bit thicker presentation with a stereotypically tube-like kind of sound or flavor to it? That's the V222. Do you want a more neutral, cleaner sounding, a little bit more clarity to your sound in there? That is the Homage. So presentationally, they have those differences there as well. I do think that the V222, even with high impedance loads, first of all, it's a little bit stronger on the low impedance stuff than the Homage is to my ear. So there's that, if you have a wide range of headphones to drive. With high impedance stuff, I think the V222 is just a tick more resolving, just a hair, okay? And it also, what struck me here as like possibly the most noticeable difference between the two, other than just the coloration of the sound, is the V222 is better in the depth dimension of the sound staging. It sounds deeper and there's a better sense of layering going on in there. But again, it's not a huge gap. It's just noticeable when I direct A-B'd these two next to each other. But they are still generally close enough where I think that the, is the V22 better or is it just different? It might be just a hair better. Maybe. But if you really don't like the warmer, thicker, more tube-like presentation of it, and you prefer the neutral, okay, and maybe leaning slightly more analytical sound, then this one is technically just a step behind, fraction of a step behind, really, the V222, and has that different kind of sound. Now, I will leave the comparisons there for now because, again, that 4-way comparison video of the Perfitus, Molnir 3, V222, and Homage is coming up in the very near future. Okay, but do I like the Homage? Yes, I do. I think it's a pretty good amplifier, particularly for high impedance loads. And another thing that I'm going to add that I didn't hit it earlier in the video, and I'll add it here right now, is this is a very good headphone amp for the Focal Utopia, at least the original. And I think that actually makes it of particular interest because used OG Utopias, at least here in the United States, are kind of going from between $1,600 and $2,000 US, on the used market there. And those Utopias are really amp picky. But this one handles it really well. And at $1,200, you get a Utopia between $1,600 and $1,800 USD, and then $1,200 for this one, and then something like the Pegasus for a DAC. And for basically $4,000-ish, maybe just a little bit more dollars than that, you are into Summit Fi headphone game with a pretty good DAC, a pretty good amp, and a very excellent headphone. So that's something to keep in mind with this too. But if you're driving high impedance headphones or most of ZMF's line, this is a really strong option out there, particularly if you like that very neutral, clean, quiet, kind of clarity focused, leaning just slightly analytical kind of sound, and you just like the general aesthetic, which may not work for everyone, but I think it's kind of cool. So the Homage can get my recommendation in those areas. So thanks again to Zach at ZMF for sending this to me. I did enjoy getting to know it, and there are definitely some areas where it's a strong contender. To the rest of you, thanks for watching. Please remember to like this video, subscribe to the channel if you haven't, leave a comment down below, check out my PayPal, check out my Patreon, generally look for ways that you can support the channel. Okay, thanks again for watching, and as always, enjoy the music.